all ideas what you...
How did I get started?
Yeah,
in
how you
this
get
inquiry?
started, right.
Well, my name is Robert Forte, and I've become over the last 35 years a scholar of psychedelic drugs in the history of religion, and I've had a very unusual and lucky career learning about these things, having had a lot of personal interaction and friendships and collaboration with some of the most important people that brought this subject to the public's attention, beginning with Albert Hofmann, the Swiss chemist who discovered LSD, and Stanislav Grof was my close teacher for a number of years, and I worked with him on several projects. And Frank Barron, the man who is one of the most important psychologists in America in the last half of the 20th century, was my main mentor and teacher for a long time. And he's not very well known in the field of psychedelic drugs, but he's a very important person because he turned on Timothy Leary, who was his best friend. They were best friends since the time they were in graduate school and all the way through to the end of his life. And Frank was co-founded the Harvard psilocybin project with Timothy Leary. And though he was really very much of an introvert compared to Tim's very public persona, Frank was one of the more important people in the modern psychedelic movement. And so I got into this subject because, well, you know, when I was a kid, I was born in 1956 in an affluent part of the United States. My father was a doctor, a dentist, who we were a very comfortable family. And when I was growing up in the 1960s, I didn't think that there was anything to be gained from psychedelic drugs. My first impression of them and their effects on the culture were that they were sort of disruptive, and the people that took them, kids in my high school and early college who took them, weren't really any wiser. They were more outrageous. They were you know, more unusual. These were very unusual experiences, but I didn't notice that it had any great effect on them, any transformative or beneficial effect. So I just kind of put them aside. I was, however, very interested in environmentalism and in political change. And I was very aware, since I was a young boy, that there was an environmental crisis that was severe, that was caused by capitalism, and that there was a great military problem in the world. You know, we were in this Cold War with the Russians, and there was a lot of fear, and there was a lot of fear of the Russians, and then an underlying fear of like annihilation, that there would be some calamity, some nuclear calamity that would destroy civilization, in the background of my thoughts. And so as I was growing up, deciding what I wanted to do, it was always going to be something that would address these problems and make the world a safer place for me and my children, or my family, my friends, for everybody. And so I began to study psychology and sociology, and eventually I became interested in religion, because I started to understand that underlying our worldview was our religious beliefs or our religious experience. And so I was a student at Columbia University in New York City, and I began to practice meditation and study the history of religion. And there, in the course, is when I became reconnected with the subject of psychedelics, because I learned about the Rig Veda, which is the oldest body of writings concerning Indian religion, and that the oldest of the Vedas was the Rig Veda, which was about this ceremony involving the ingestion of a plant, a sacred plant drink that would give visions of the nature of the universe and direct man's life here. And so the people had come to understand that this drink, soma, was actually a mushroom, a psychedelic mushroom. And I remember hearing this in a lecture and thinking, wow, how I didn't realize that these psychedelic drugs that kids were using in high school and in college kind of recreationally actually had this deep religious significance. And so I was curious, and I began to read very much about them. I devoured all the books that I could, and in a very short time I decided to take one of these. I had a mushroom experience myself. I'd been practicing meditation, and I took it in this kind of serious way, and things began to happen that were really quite extraordinary. I moved to California, where
When it was?
well, this was in the late 1970s, and I moved to California in 1979, and that's where I met Frank Barron, and he encouraged me to look into this as an academic career, to see about starting conversations again in the university.
Here in the university?
In the universities here in the United States. You know, this was 1981. Psychedelics were very popular and in the news in the 1960s and up until around the mid-70s maybe. Then they started to fade. They become illegal, and they stopped being a big social issue. And so there was a quiet period, and Frank thought, and there were a number that we had an academic conference, and we would excite people to begin this conversation, taking another look at psychedelic drugs, and looking at their more deeper significance in religious studies and in transpersonal psychology. And so that's how I got started. It's a long answer.
Tell me about Frank more. Who he?
Well, Frank Barron is an extraordinary. He passed away in 2002. He was his life history is really very important. He fought in World War II. He was at the Battle of Normandy, and he was traumatized during this experience. He was in a bombing raid, and he had to spend the night hidden in the carcass of a cow to evade capture and keep himself safe. And this traumatized him a lot. He came out of the war and began to try to work first as a journalist, and then he entered graduate school for psychology. And extraordinarily brilliant man, he very quickly established himself as an expert in the diagnosis and assessment of personality, not so much working in clinical psychology, but more in just psychology in general. So doing personality assessments, not really diagnosis. And he helped develop tests, the Minnesota multiphasic person, the MMPI, which is still a widely used test. Frank had to do with the development of that. And he was doing his PhD at the University of California, Berkeley in the 1950s. And along with a great many psychologists in the 1950s, Frank was one that was concerned with, these guys had just fought this horrible war. And it was a concern of many social scientists to try to figure out, how did this happen? How did the German people fall for this ruthless authoritarian dictator? Germany, one of the most civilized countries of the Western world, a long-running democracy, and great cultural contributions. How did these people suddenly fall for this ruthless authoritarian fascist government? And so they wondered about this. A lot of theories in social psychology and experiments on consciousness and on conformity and on obedience, and important research in this area. And some of it was going on at Berkeley in the 1950s. And Frank was part of that. They were concerned. A lot of American scientists, social scientists, were becoming concerned in the 1950s that this was happening in America, that the same sort of pathological obedience to authority and conformity and people acting against their own common sense and own human values in order to conform to the dictates of a leader.
Okay.
So he's at Berkeley. He's
Right.
doing these investigations into personality styles, the fascist personality, the authoritarian
I
personality,
understand.
the creative personality, the democratic personality, and began to understand what are the differences, how can you change one, make an authoritarian more open. And one of the things that they realized in this, I'm summarizing what I've said, one of the things that they realized in this research was that people who were subservient to authoritarian rule had their worldview was such that nature was a kind of, the world was a threatening place. It was your basic position was, it was scary. Nature was scary. You needed to, or there were enemies out there that you needed to protect yourself from, versus a psychological system, a personality that is based on the idea that nature is a friendly place, and that we really just kind of trust our inner view and harmonize with nature and flow with nature. And you see there's a very different kind of mentality here that has to do with nature and one's sense of self. An original sense of goodness in your soul, or that your original sin. So how religious systems and political systems and propaganda play on these underlying tendencies is a great study, and part of what motivated Frank Barron and Timothy Leary to start the psychedelic revolution. So it was in the context of this kind of inquiry that Frank had his first experience with the psilocybin mushroom. Down in Mexico, he was studying a group of writers, and they turned him on to this, and he thought this could be a thing that could really help transform American society, because by providing this very profound religious experience, a reconnection, literally, that word religion means to reconnect, to have this experience of unitive consciousness. And Frank thought could be such a major transformative event in a person's life that it could help save the idea of democracy. And so he came back and told Tim this, and he had to persuade him at first. This is kind of one of the funny stories in the history of psychedelics, that when Timothy Leary first learned of psychedelic mushrooms from his best friend and drinking buddy, they were heroic drinkers. Tim told him to shut up, don't even talk about it. You're going to lose your credibility in science. I'm certainly not ever going to take any of these mushrooms. And but Frank finally persisted and convinced him, and once he had it, he realized that he would have to devote his life to it.
When it was?
Well, this was, Frank had his first experience in 1958, and Tim didn't have his until 1959. And at that time they were both on the faculty at Harvard.
In psychology?
In psychology, yeah.
Okay.